a boy from Medellin. He was a sickly child. That is the first thing worth knowing about the man who would eventually march an army across a continent, sink his own fleet on a beach, and topple one of the great civilizations of the pre-modern world. In the small, dusty town of Jaén, in the province of Extremadura, in the Kingdom of Castile, in the year 1485, a boy named Hernán Cortés de Monroy y Pizarro Altamirano was born to minor nobility and nearly did not survive his infancy. His father, Martín, was an infantry captain of modest means. His mother, Catalina, was a pious woman of the lower gentry. The household was cramped. The purse was thin. The family had the long, proud name of the Spanish Hidalgo class, the lesser nobility, but not the land, not the money, and not the influence to make the name mean what it was supposed to mean. What they had instead was something more useful to a boy who would grow up hungry. They had cousins. They had second cousins. They had a web of relations stretching outward into the larger Pizarro and Monroy clans, some of whom would go on to become the most terrifying men in the Americas. Extremadura, the land he was born to, was itself a kind of fever dream of a region. The name means roughly the land beyond the Duero, a stretch of stony plateau and scrub oak in western Spain, baked in summer and cruel in winter. It was the part of the country the Romans had mined for silver. The Visigoths had half settled, and the Moors had held for centuries before being pushed back. By the 15th century, it was a place that produced three things in unusual quantity: pigs, soldiers, and a particular breed of ambitious young men who looked east across the sea and saw something glittering on the horizon. Francisco Pizarro, who would later conquer the Incas, was from Trujillo, about 60 miles north. Hernando de Soto, who would die looking for gold along the Mississippi, was from Jerez de los Caballeros, about the same distance south. Something in the soil of Extremadura grew men who could not sit still. The boy was not, however, being groomed for any of this. He was being groomed by his anxious parents to be a lawyer. At 14, they sent him to Salamanca. This is a detail that almost everyone skips past, and almost everyone should not. Salamanca in 1499 was one of the four great universities of Europe, alongside Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. It was the intellectual engine of the Castilian crown. It taught Roman law, canon law, Latin, rhetoric, and theology, and it taught them at a level that produced the clerks, notaries, and diplomats who ran the Spanish Empire. When a boy from a minor Extremaduran family was sent to Salamanca, he was being aimed, with the full force of his parents' hopes, at a desk, a nice, safe, salaried desk in Valladolid or Seville, pushing paper for the crown. He lasted 2 years. He found the classroom insufferable. He went home in disgrace. And here is where the biographers, with a small, tidy sigh, usually shift to the next section. But we should pause, because what he did in those 2 years at Salamanca would matter, decades later, more than almost anything else in his life. He did not become a lawyer, but he learned to sound like one. He learned the Latin of the courts, the structure of a legal brief, the choreography of a petition to the crown. He learned how to frame a mutiny as a loyal act, a private seizure as a public service, and a personal war as a matter of imperial law. He would spend the rest of his life wrapping ferocious acts in careful paperwork, and he learned how in that classroom he supposedly hated. He came home to Medellin in 1501, 16 years old, with a head full of half-learned Latin and nothing to do. He spent 2 years drifting. He got into fights. He climbed, according to one story, a garden wall to reach a married woman, fell, and was nearly killed by the collapsing masonry. He was, in short, the kind of young man whom respectable fathers drink about. And then, in 1504, he did what every bored, landless second-son Hidalgo in Extremadura was starting to do. He got on a boat. Part 2. Hispaniola and the Long Apprenticeship. The New World in 1504 was not yet the New World of legend. It was not yet the land of gold and silver fleets. It was a cluster of sickly sugar plantations and failing mines on the island of Hispaniola, the Spanish settlement that would later be split between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. Columbus had made his first landfall 12 years before. The great indigenous civilizations of the mainland, the Aztecs, the Incas, the Maya, were still entirely unknown to the Spanish. Nobody had any idea they were there. Cortés arrived at Santo Domingo at 19. He was given a small grant of land and a small allotment of indigenous laborers under the encomendero system, a kind of legalized forced labor that the Spanish had imported to extract whatever they could from the islands. He was, for the next 15 years, essentially a minor colonial functionary. He farmed, he traded, he served as a notary. Yes, the Salamanca training finally came in useful in the small town of Azua. He made a little money. He made the right connections. He made himself useful. This 15-year apprenticeship is, again, something the dramatic tellings of his story tend to skip. But it is where he became the man who could do what he did. He learned, in those years, how the Spanish imperial system actually worked. He learned that the crown was far away, that the governors and royal officials on the ground were often corrupt and always competing with each other, and that a clever man with the right paperwork and the right patrons could get away with an astonishing amount. He learned the vocabulary of indigenous languages, at least in Pidgin. He learned how a colonial expedition was provisioned, financed, and led. He learned how to read men. Which ones would follow, which ones would betray, which ones could be bought. In 1511, he joined an expedition led by Diego Velázquez to conquer Cuba. The word conquer is slightly misleading. The indigenous population of Cuba was already reeling from disease, and the local resistance was not organized. It was closer to an occupation than a war. But Cortés served well, earned Velázquez's trust, and came out of the campaign as a rising man in the colonial administration. Velázquez, now governor of Cuba, gave him land, laborers, a new encomienda, and eventually a position as mayor of the town of Santiago de Cuba. He married, in these years, a woman named Catalina Suarez, under circumstances that remained slightly murky. There were rumors that Velázquez had pressured the marriage because of some insult to Catalina's honor. There were rumors that Cortés had initially resisted. The marriage was not, by any account, a happy one. Catalina would follow him to Mexico years later and die there suddenly, under circumstances that some of his enemies would later claim were suspicious. We do not know, and will never know, exactly what happened. What we do know is that by 1518, at the age of 33, Cortés was one of the wealthier men in Cuba, a trusted subordinate of the governor, and a person of some consequence in the small, incestuous world of the Spanish Caribbean. And then late in that year, Velázquez gave him the assignment that would change everything. A previous expedition, led by Juan de Grijalva, had sailed along the coast of what is now Mexico and returned with two things. One was a small quantity of gold, traded or extorted from coastal peoples. The other was a story half understood through layers of translation, about a great and fabulously wealthy empire somewhere inland, ruled by a king whose cities were built on a lake. Velázquez wanted to find out if it was true. He commissioned an expedition to explore, to trade, and, crucially, not to conquer. He did not trust Cortés enough to give him the authority to conquer anything. He gave him ships, he gave him men, he gave him supplies, and he gave him a very carefully worded set of instructions that kept him on a short leash. Cortés understood the instructions perfectly. He understood them the way a lawyer understands instructions. That is to say, he understood them as a starting point for negotiation. He spent the next several weeks in a frenzy of preparation. He mortgaged everything he owned. He borrowed from every merchant who would lend to him. He began assembling men, horses, cannon, and supplies at a pace that began to alarm Velázquez, who realized, much too late, that he had chosen the wrong man. On the eve of departure, Velázquez rode down to the harbor at Santiago to revoke the commission. Cortés sailed that night. Part 3. The Beach at Veracruz. The fleet that left Cuba in February of 1519 consisted of 11 ships, about 550 Spanish soldiers, 16 horses, about a dozen cannons of various sizes, and a few hundred indigenous auxiliaries and servants. It was not a large force. It was, in fact, almost laughably small for what it was about to attempt, except that nobody, not Cortés, not his men, not Velázquez, not the court in Madrid, yet understood what it was about to attempt. They thought they were going trading. They made landfall first on the island of Cozumel, off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, where Cortés had his first great stroke of luck. He recovered a Spanish castaway named Jerónimo de Aguilar, who had been shipwrecked in the region 8 years earlier and had lived among the Maya ever since, learning their language. Aguilar would serve as a translator. A few weeks later, marching along the coast, he had his second great stroke of luck. After a brief battle with a coastal people, he received as part of a peace offering a young indigenous woman. The Spanish would call her Doña Marina. Her own people called her Malinche. History would remember her as La Malinche, and she would become, depending on who is telling the story, either the mother of modern Mexico or its original traitor. She was, by most accounts in her late teens, fluent in both the Maya that Aguilar spoke and in Nahuatl, the language of the Aztec Empire. She was also, by every account, intelligent, composed, and politically astute in ways that her captors took a long time to fully appreciate. The translation chain in those early weeks was baroque. Cortés would speak in Spanish, Aguilar would translate into Maya, Malinche would translate from Maya into Nahuatl. The response would come back through the same chain in reverse. Within a few months, Malinche had taught herself enough Spanish to bypass Aguilar entirely. Within a year, she was Cortés's constant companion, his interpreter, his intelligence chief, his political advisor, and the mother of his eldest son. She would not leave his side until the conquest was complete. In April of 1519, the fleet anchored off the coast of what is now the state of Veracruz. And here, on a hot stretch of beach, Cortés performed the most audacious legal maneuver of his career. He had a problem. His commission from Velázquez authorized him only to trade, not to conquer. If he proceeded inland, and he had already decided, within days of landing, that he was going to proceed inland, he would be acting outside his orders. He would be, in plain language, a mutineer. Anything he seized, including any gold he acquired, would legally belong to Velázquez, and Cortés himself could be arrested and hanged upon his return. So he founded a city. This seems, in the retelling, like an almost comic gesture. There was no city. There were a few hundred men sweating on a beach. But Cortés understood something that Velázquez had not considered. Under Spanish law, a properly chartered municipality, a villa, had the right to elect its own officials. And those officials derived their authority not from any colonial governor, but directly from the crown itself. If he founded a town, and if the town council then appointed him captain general, he would no longer be answerable to Velázquez. He would be answerable only to King Charles, who was very far away, who had never heard of him, and who could be addressed directly by letter. He founded La Villa Rica de la Vera Cruz, the rich town of the True Cross, on the beach. He had his men elect a town council. The council, composed almost entirely of his loyalists, immediately appointed him Captain General and Chief Justice. He drew up the appropriate documents in the appropriate Latin. He sent a ship back to Spain, not to Cuba, carrying a long letter to the king, a sample of the gold they had already acquired, and a careful legal case explaining why he, Cortés, was now acting as the direct agent of the crown. It was mutiny dressed in the robes of loyalty. It was, in a technical sense, treason. It was also legally nearly bulletproof. And then, with the beach town chartered and the legal paperwork on its way to Madrid, he did the thing that made his name. He destroyed the ships. The traditional phrase is, he burned his boats, and the phrase has entered the language as a shorthand for any irrevocable act of commitment. What he actually did was slightly less dramatic and slightly more practical. He ordered most of the ships scuttled, stripped of anything useful, and then sunk or beached, leaving only a single vessel able to sail, which was promptly sent back to Spain with his letter. The effect was the same. There was no longer any way for his men to return to Cuba. There was no longer any way to retreat. The only direction left was forward, into a continent none of them had ever seen, toward a city none of them had ever imagined, ruled by an empire whose name they could barely pronounce. He told his men, in the speech that has come down to us through the accounts of Bernal Diaz del Castillo and others, that they would go forward together and trust in God. What he did not need to say, because it was obvious, was that he had just made his own survival dependent on their success. He could not go back to Cuba without a victory big enough to justify the mutiny, and they could not go back at all. He had welded his fate to theirs, on the beach, in front of all of them, and the only way out was through. Part 4. The March to Tenochtitlán. The empire that awaited them was not, in the strict sense, an empire. Or rather, it was not the kind of empire the Spanish understood. The Spanish thought of empire the way the Romans had, a central authority that had conquered neighboring peoples and absorbed them, more or less, into a common political structure, with common laws and common loyalties. The Aztec Empire, more accurately called the Mexica Triple Alliance, a confederation of 3 city-states centered on Tenochtitlán, was something stranger and, for its rivals, something more brittle. It was closer to a vast protection racket. The Mexica had, over the preceding century, gradually conquered or cowed the city-states of central Mexico, but they had not absorbed them. They had left each of them with its own ruler, its own local government, its own temples and gods, and its own deep and often fresh memory of the Mexica coming over the mountains to burn crops and carry away prisoners. The conquered peoples paid tribute, in maize, in cotton, in jade, in feathers, and, most infamously, in human beings for sacrifice, and in return they were, on most days, left alone. But they hated Tenochtitlán. They had every reason to hate Tenochtitlán, and the Mexica, who understood this perfectly well, kept them in line through a combination of fear, ritual terror, and occasional overwhelming violence. This was the political terrain Cortés walked into. He did not, at first, understand it. Nobody on his expedition did. But Malinche did. Malinche was herself Nahua, a native speaker of the imperial language, and she came from one of the tribute-paying peripheral regions. She understood, in her bones, what the Spanish did not. She understood that the Mexica Empire was not a country. It was a lid on a pot of boiling water, and the lid was only barely holding. The first major test came at Tlaxcala. The Tlaxcalans were a confederation of 4 independent city-states in the highlands east of the Valley of Mexico. They had resisted Mexica conquest for generations and had been essentially besieged for decades, cut off from salt and cotton and the goods of the coast. They were the single most stubborn holdout against the empire. When the Spanish approached their territory, they did what they did to any stranger. They attacked. The battles with Tlaxcala lasted about 2 weeks. The Spanish were outnumbered by an order of magnitude or more. They took casualties. They nearly broke more than once. But the combination of steel armor, horses, crossbows, firearms, and disciplined European infantry tactics did something the Tlaxcalans had never seen. The Spanish did not die easily. They did not run. They killed in numbers and with a kind of cold mechanical efficiency that the indigenous warriors, for whom warfare was partly a ritualized affair, focused on capturing prisoners for sacrifice, simply could not match. And after 2 weeks, the Tlaxcalan elders, shrewd men, experienced in the politics of survival, did something remarkable. They stopped fighting. They invited Cortés into their capital. They offered an alliance. The offer was cold and clear. They would feed him, shelter him, and fight alongside him. In return, they wanted one thing. They wanted him to march on Tenochtitlan. This was the hinge point of the entire conquest, and it is the part of the story that the legend usually underplays. From Tlaxcala forward, Cortés was no longer leading a Spanish expedition of 500 men. He was leading an indigenous coalition of tens of thousands, with a Spanish hardcore at its center. The Tlaxcalans provided the bulk of his army, his logistics, his local intelligence, and when things went wrong, his refuge. The final siege of Tenochtitlán would be fought by somewhere between 50 and 200,000 indigenous allies, alongside fewer than 1,000 Spaniards. The conquest of Mexico was, by sheer headcount, an indigenous civil war. Cortés was the man who recognized this first and exploited it most ruthlessly. From Tlaxcala, they marched west, toward the lake. They stopped at Cholula, a great religious city loyal to the Mexica, where Cortés, acting on intelligence from Malinche, who had heard from local women that an ambush was being prepared, ordered a preemptive massacre of the Cholulan nobility in the central square. Thousands died. It was a calculated act of terror intended to broadcast a message to every city between there and Tenochtitlan. The message was received. They climbed the passes between the great volcanoes, Popocatépetl and Iztaccíhuatl, with the snow on the peaks and the thin air of 9,000 feet burning in their lungs. And then, on a day in early November of 1519, they came over the ridge and looked down into the Valley of Mexico. What they saw silenced them. Below them, stretching to the horizon, lay a vast blue lake. In the middle of the lake, connected to the shore by 3 enormous stone causeways, stood a city. It was larger than any city any of them had ever seen. Larger than Seville, larger than Rome, larger by modern estimates than any city in Europe at that date. 250,000 people lived there. The avenues were broad and straight. The canals ran through the streets like the canals of Venice. The great pyramids of the sacred precinct rose above the flat roofs like white mountains. Flowers grew on the rooftops. Boats moved on the lake like flocks of birds. In the market of a northern district of the city, 60,000 people gathered every day to trade in gold, in jade, in cacao, in feathers, in cloth, in food the Spaniards had no name for. Bernal Diaz, writing his memoir 50 years later as an old man in Guatemala, would remember that moment for the rest of his life. He wrote that some of his companions asked whether what they saw was not a dream. It was not a dream. It was Tenochtitlan, and they were about to walk into it. Part 5. The Hostage King. On November 8th, 1519, Cortés and his men marched across the southern causeway into the city. They were met, on the causeway itself, by a procession of Mexica nobility in formal dress, and at the head of the procession was the ruler himself, Moctezuma Xocoyotzin, the Huey Tlatoani, the great speaker, whom the Spanish would call Montezuma. The meeting was cordial. Moctezuma greeted Cortés with gifts and with courtesy. He installed the Spaniards in a palace that had belonged to his father, the palace of Axayacatl, directly adjacent to the great temple precinct. He provided them with food, with servants, with every comfort. They were, officially, his honored guests. They were also, in every practical sense, inside a trap. There were several hundred men in a city of 250,000, separated from dry land by 3 narrow causeways, each of which could be cut by removing a wooden bridge. If Moctezuma decided to kill them, they would die. The question that has haunted historians for 500 years is why he did not. The old answer, the one that comes down through the Spanish chronicles and the early post-conquest histories, is that Moctezuma mistook Cortés for a returning god, specifically for Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent who is prophesied to return from the east. This story is probably, in its strong form, a myth. The evidence for the Quetzalcoatl prophecy as a coherent, pre-existing belief is thin and mostly post-conquest. It appears to have been elaborated, or perhaps invented by indigenous informants after the fact, in conversation with Spanish friars who were looking for exactly that kind of providential explanation. The more honest answer is that we do not know. Moctezuma may have been genuinely paralyzed by theological uncertainty. He may have been conducting a cautious diplomacy, trying to take the measure of these strange visitors before committing to action. He may have been undermined by factions within his own court, some of whom wanted immediate war, and some of whom wanted to wait. He may simply have miscalculated. Great rulers sometimes do. What is clear is that he hesitated, and that hesitation was fatal. 2 weeks after entering the city, Cortés made his move. It was, in its way, even more audacious than the scuttling of the ships. He walked into the royal palace with a small group of his captains, engaged Moctezuma in a long and seemingly cordial conversation, and then, at a pre-arranged moment, informed the emperor that he was now under Spanish protection and would be residing henceforth in the Spanish quarters. Moctezuma, flanked by his own guards in his own capital, surrounded by a city of hundreds of thousands of his own subjects, submitted. He walked out of his palace with the Spanish and did not return as a free man. He was, from that day forward, a hostage in his own city. For the next several months, a strange and impossible equilibrium held. Moctezuma continued, outwardly, to rule. He held audiences, he issued decrees, he collected tribute, but every decision passed through Spanish hands, and every word he spoke in public was, in effect, vetted by his captors. Cortés extracted, in this period, a staggering quantity of gold. He also extracted something more valuable: time. Time to learn the city, to map the causeways, to study the politics of the court, to identify which nobles might be turned and which would have to be killed. He even, in an act of theological audacity that appalls even historians who admire him, marched up the steps of the great temple, demanded that the images of Huitzilopochtli and Tezcatlipoca be removed, and replaced them with images of the Virgin Mary and the crucified Christ. The Mexica priests wept openly. The pragmatic compromise that eventually emerged, the Christian images on one side of the pyramid platform, the indigenous gods on the other, satisfied nobody and enraged everyone. The equilibrium could not hold, and it did not. In the spring of 1520, word reached Cortés that a much larger Spanish force had arrived on the coast, sent by Velázquez to arrest him. Cortés left most of his men in Tenochtitlán under the command of his lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, and raced back to the coast with a small force. In one of the most remarkable feats of his career, he attacked the larger Spanish force by night, captured its commander, and then, in a stroke of political theater that only he could have pulled off, convinced most of the captured soldiers to join his own expedition instead. He marched back to Tenochtitlan with more than twice the men he had left with. He arrived to find the city in open revolt. Alvarado, in his absence, had done something catastrophic. During a great religious festival in the central precinct of the city, with thousands of unarmed Mexica nobles gathered in ceremonial dress, he had ordered a massacre. Why he did it has never been fully explained. He may have genuinely feared an uprising. He may have been paranoid. He may have, as some of his men later testified, simply wanted the gold jewelry the nobles were wearing. Whatever the reason, Spanish soldiers had blocked the exits of the temple courtyard and killed hundreds of unarmed men. The city exploded. By the time Cortés returned, the causeways were blocked, the bridges pulled, the markets closed, the Spaniards besieged in their palace with dwindling food and water. Moctezuma himself, brought up to a rooftop to plead for calm, was struck by stones thrown by his own people. Some accounts say he died of the wounds, some say the Spanish killed him once he was no longer useful, and in any case he was gone, and with him any fiction of peaceful authority. They had to run. Part 6. La Noche Triste. On the night of June 30th, 1520, in a downpour, Cortés ordered his army to attempt a breakout along the western causeway toward the mainland. They took their wounded, they took their horses, they took as much gold as they could carry, and they took a portable wooden bridge to lay across the gaps where the Mexica had torn out the permanent bridges. They moved in silence. They were detected almost immediately. What happened over the next several hours would be remembered in Spanish tradition as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows, and it was, for Cortés personally, the closest he came in his life to total annihilation. The Mexica swarmed the causeway from canoes on both sides. The portable bridge jammed at the first gap and could not be recovered. Men weighed down with looted gold fell into the water and drowned. The horses panicked. The rain made firearms useless. Spanish soldiers were pulled from the causeway by Mexica warriors and dragged off to be sacrificed the next morning on the steps of the great temple. By dawn, roughly half his force was dead. Some sources put the number higher. The treasure was lost. Most of the horses were dead. Most of the cannon were at the bottom of the lake. Alvarado was wounded. Cortés himself had taken blows to the head and left hand and had at one point been knocked to his knees by a Mexica warrior before being rescued by one of his men. The survivors regrouped on the mainland, bloodied and exhausted, and began a long, broken retreat back toward Tlaxcala territory. The retreat itself nearly ended them. A week later, at the plain of Otuma, the Mexica army caught up with them and attacked in force. The Spanish were outnumbered by something like 20 to 1. They were starving. They were wounded. They should have died there. What happened at Otumba is one of those episodes that sounds, in the telling, like mythology, and yet is attested by multiple independent sources. Cortés, seeing the standard of the Mexica commander rising above the mass of warriors, realized that indigenous armies were organized around the person of the commander and the symbolic banner he carried. Kill the commander, take the banner, and the army would dissolve. He gathered his remaining mounted knights, 12 men no more, and led a mad cavalry charge directly through the press of warriors, straight at the banner. The charge reached the commander. The commander was killed, the banner was taken, and the Mexica army, exactly as Cortés had gambled, broke and scattered. He limped into Tlaxcala with the remnants of his force. The Tlaxcalan elders looked at him, this man who had marched into their lands a year earlier with a fleet and 500 men, who now returned with barely 300 and had lost everything, and they made a decision that, in retrospect, decided the fate of a continent. They did not throw him out. They took him in. They fed him. They gave him their houses for the winter. They listened as he told them he was going to do it all over again, and they believed him. And then they went to war with him. Part 7. The Siege. The Siege of Tenochtitlan is, in military history, an operation of a very particular and very terrible kind. Cortés spent 7 months preparing for it. He wrote to Hispaniola for reinforcements and got them. Ships continued to arrive on the coast, some sent by his growing circle of supporters, some simply drawn by rumor of gold. He now had roughly 1,000 Spanish soldiers, 100 horses and cannon. He also had the Tlaxcalans, the Texcocans who had broken with the Triple Alliance, and a steadily growing coalition of other city-states that had calculated which way the wind was blowing. Estimates of his total indigenous force by the end of the siege run as high as 200,000. But he had understood by now that Tenochtitlan could not simply be stormed along the causeways. The causeways were killing ground. What he needed was control of the lake itself. And so he ordered, from his headquarters at Texcoco on the eastern shore, the construction of 13 brigantines, small, single-masted warships built in pieces by his carpenter Martin Lopez, hauled across 50 miles of mountain terrain on the backs of Tlaxcalan porters and assembled on the shore of Lake Texcoco. The brigantines carried sails, oars, cannon, and crossbowmen. They would, when launched, sweep the lake clear of Mexica canoes and cut the city off from the mainland. This is a detail worth sitting with. To build a navy, in pieces in the mountains, and to carry it across the Sierra on human shoulders and reassemble it on the edge of an enemy lake is not the kind of thing a desperate fugitive does. It is the kind of thing an imperial general does. Somewhere in the long Tlaxcalan winter of 1520, Cortés had stopped being a mutineer and started being something else. He had started being a conqueror. The siege began in May of 1521 and lasted, with gruesome intensity, for 75 days. The new emperor of the Mexica, Cuauhtémoc, young, fierce, and under no illusions about who he was fighting, had prepared the city as well as he could. He had stockpiled food, reinforced the causeways, and trained his warriors for the new tactics the Spanish had used in the previous siege. He fought brilliantly, and the Spanish and their allies paid for every street, every canal, every bridge in blood. Cortés attacked the city simultaneously from 3 causeways. The brigantines patrolled the lake, destroying any Mexica canoe that approached. Indigenous allies by the tens of thousands filled in the canals with rubble so that Spanish cavalry and cannon could cross. When a block of the city was taken, it was torn down, houses demolished, temples leveled, the rubble used to fill the next canal, so that the Spanish could press forward along a widening causeway of their own making. They were literally unbuilding the city as they advanced through it. The Mexica fought back. They fought back with a ferocity that shook even hardened Spanish veterans. They captured Spanish soldiers alive and sacrificed them on the Great Pyramid in full view of their surviving comrades below. The Spanish down on the causeways could see their friends being marched up the temple steps, could hear the drums, could see the bodies thrown down the other side. Cortés himself was captured briefly during one Mexica counterattack, and only pulled free by his own men after a desperate fight. Meanwhile, inside the city, another enemy was working. Smallpox, which had arrived with a single infected African slave on the coast during the previous year, had swept through Tenochtitlán during the siege. It killed indiscriminately. It killed warriors, it killed priests, it killed women and children and the old. It killed Cuauhtémoc's predecessor, Cuitlahuac, within 80 days of his taking office. It is impossible to say with precision how many of the city's defenders died of disease rather than weapons, but it is certain that the defense was fatally weakened by the epidemic before the siege was half over. By August, the city was a ruin. The defenders were starving. Cuauhtémoc, attempting to escape by canoe with his household, was captured on the lake. He was brought before Cortés. He is said to have touched the dagger at Cortés's belt and asked that Cortés use it to kill him at once, since he had done everything he could to defend his city and had failed. Cortés did not kill him. He took him prisoner, tortured him later for the location of the rest of the treasure Cortés was convinced must still exist, which probably did not, and eventually executed him several years later on campaign in Honduras on charges of conspiracy that were almost certainly fabricated. Tenochtitlán fell on August 1521. Roughly 250,000 people had died inside it. The lake was choked with corpses, the canals were black, the great pyramids were charred and defaced, the markets were empty, whole districts had been leveled to their foundations. The survivors, weeping, walked out of the city over bridges of stone they had built themselves, passing through Spanish lines where they were counted, sorted, branded, and in many cases enslaved. Cortés, looking at the ruin of the greatest city in the Americas, is recorded as having wept. Whether for the dead or for himself, the sources do not say. It may have been both. He was 36 years old. He had, in a little more than 2 years, destroyed an empire, killed something like 100,000 people directly and another several 100,000 indirectly through disease and famine, and acquired for his king a territory larger than all of Spain. He had also, although he did not yet know it, sealed the fate of every other great civilization in the Americas. The template for what he had done, disease, alliance with disaffected locals, legal maneuvering, relentless pressure, would be copied with variations by Pizarro in Peru and by 100 other men across 2 continents for the next 300 years. He began the next morning to supervise the rebuilding. Part 8. The Years of Decline. The rest of his life is a long anticlimax, and it is instructive for that reason. He remained, for a few years, the master of the new territory. He founded Mexico City on top of the ruins of Tenochtitlan, draining sections of the lake, using the stones of the old temples to build the new cathedral, an act of theological architecture so literal that it still startles visitors to the Zócalo in Mexico City today. He organized the colonial administration. He redistributed land and labor. He sent expeditions north, south, and west, extending Spanish control into what is now Guatemala, Honduras, and the northern reaches of Mexico. He wrote long, careful letters back to the king, the Cartas de Relación, defending his actions, narrating his triumphs, and lobbying relentlessly for recognition and reward. And then, slowly, the court began to turn against him. Part of it was the natural jealousy of distant officials toward a subordinate who had become more famous than they were. Part of it was the legal aftermath of the original mutiny. Velázquez had died, but his faction had not, and they filed complaints and lawsuits in Madrid for years. Part of it was simply the Habsburg administrative style, which distrusted independent action in distant provinces and preferred to dilute the power of successful generals by appointing parallel officials to watch them. A royal audit, a residencia, was launched into his conduct. Commissioners were sent from Spain. His authority was quietly clipped. In 1528 he returned to Spain in person to plead his case at court, bringing with him a small retinue of indigenous nobles, jaguars, and the kind of showy gifts that impressed the Habsburg court. The king received him with formal honors. He was granted the title of Marqués del Val de Oaxaca, given a vast estate in Mexico, and confirmed in his wealth. But he was not given what he actually wanted. He was not named Viceroy of New Spain. That office went, in 1535, to a man named Antonio de Mendoza, a career administrator and a creature of the court. Cortés, the conqueror himself, was passed over for the governorship of the land he had conquered. He went back to Mexico in 1530 and spent the next decade as a private citizen, an extraordinarily wealthy private citizen, but a private citizen. He managed his estates. He led a few more expeditions, including an ill-fated voyage up the Gulf of California in search of a fabled northern passage, during which he sighted the peninsula that would eventually be named for his party's imagined land of Amazon's Calafia and hence California. The expeditions lost money, the estates made money. The new viceroy and the new courts handled the governing. Cortés sulked. In 1540 he sailed back to Spain one last time, hoping to rekindle the king's interest, hoping for one more campaign, one more command, one more recognition. He was now 55 years old. The king was away on imperial business. The courtiers made him wait. The famous story, possibly apocryphal, but too perfect not to repeat, has Cortés, frustrated after weeks of waiting in an antechamber, finally climbing onto the step of Charles's carriage as it pulled away, demanding attention. The king asks him who he is. Cortés replies, "I am the man who has given you more provinces than your ancestors left you cities." Whether he said it or not, the sentiment is exactly right. He had done more for the Spanish crown than any other single individual in its history, and the crown, having received everything he had to give, was quietly finished with him. He died in a village near Seville in December of 1547, waiting to return to Mexico at the age of 62. His body was moved more than a dozen times over the following centuries, between Spain and Mexico, and at various points it was hidden, exhumed, reburied in secret to keep it from being desecrated during the various waves of anti-Spanish feeling that followed Mexican independence. It rests today in a small and deliberately unmarked crypt in the Church of Jesus de Nazareno in Mexico City, a church that stands by tradition on the exact spot where he first met Moctezuma on the causeway on a November morning in 1519. There is no statue of him in Mexico City. There is no national holiday in his name. In the country he created, he is, officially, a ghost. Part 9. The man in full. So what do we make of him? The easy move is to collapse him into one of two cartoons. One is the heroic version, inherited from the 19th century historians who wrote romantic histories of the conquest in the language of high adventure. Cortés as a kind of Iberian Odysseus, the cunning captain, the lawgiver, the bringer of Christianity and civilization to a benighted land. The other is the mirror image, the villain of the modern revisionist reading, Cortés as an early architect of genocide, a looter, a rapist, the first and worst of the European conquistadors, the man who lit the match on the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. Both readings contain truth. Neither contains all of it. The heroic version is not wrong about his abilities. He was a brilliant strategist. He was a superb reader of political terrain. He was a leader who could hold together a polyglot army under conditions that should have broken it 10 times over. He was, as a matter of historical record, one of the most effective military commanders of the early modern period, and he accomplished what he accomplished with resources that even his contemporaries thought insufficient. Napoleon, 400 years later, was said to have studied him. Any honest accounting of his life has to grant him those things. The villain version is not wrong either. He was responsible, directly and indirectly, for a staggering human catastrophe. The population of central Mexico collapsed within a generation of the conquest, from something like 25 million before contact to perhaps 1 or 2 million by 1600. Disease did most of the killing, but the social dislocation of the conquest, the destruction of the priestly classes, the breakup of the agricultural systems, the enslavement and relocation of entire communities amplified the demographic damage beyond what the diseases alone could have done. He enslaved indigenous people. He tortured Cuauhtémoc. He almost certainly arranged the executions of rivals. He seems in his personal life to have been at minimum a serial adulterer and at worst something considerably uglier. The suspicion that he murdered his first wife was taken seriously enough that it was formally investigated, though never proved. He was capable of acts of calculated terror. The massacre at Cholula was a calculated act of terror, and he appears to have felt little hesitation about them. But the more interesting reading is the one that refuses either cartoon. It is the reading that holds both men in view at the same time, the brilliant captain and the war criminal, the loyal husband and the predator, the devout Catholic and the tormentor of indigenous priests, the man who wept at the fall of Tenochtitlán, and the man who then personally supervised the tearing down of its temples. He is not easy to hold in the mind all at once. He was not easy to hold in the mind at the time either. His own chaplain, Francisco López de Gomera, who knew him and wrote the first great Spanish biography of him, could not decide what he thought of him from one chapter to the next. What makes Cortés interesting, finally, is not that he was a great man or a terrible man, although he was both. It is that he was a coherent man. Everything that made him effective, the legal cunning, the capacity for cold violence, the genius for alliance, the gift for rhetoric, the willingness to burn his own ships on a beach, and commit himself irrevocably to a course of action, is the same material that made him, in human terms, devastating. You cannot subtract the terrible parts and keep the brilliant parts. They are the same parts. The same nerve that let him walk into Moctezuma's palace and take him hostage is the same nerve that let him order the massacre at Cholula. The same lawyer's imagination that let him found a town on a beach to outmaneuver his governor is the same imagination that let him dress each of his seizures of power in the language of loyalty and law. The same iron capacity for commitment that got him across the mountains with his army intact is the same capacity that let him preside, without flinching, over the methodical destruction of a civilization. This is, incidentally, the uncomfortable shape of a great many of the most consequential figures in history. We would like the good and the bad in them to be separable, so that we could honor the former and discard the latter. They almost never are. The traits that produce world-changing achievement are rarely in themselves gentle traits. The men and women who make history do so by being exactly the people they are, not by being better versions of themselves. Cortés is a case study in that uncomfortable truth. He was what he was all the way down. The lawyer, the soldier, the mutineer, the founder, the destroyer. Those are not 5 different men. They are one man, running in one direction, without hesitation, without retreat, for the entire length of his adult life. He burned his boats on the beach in 1519 and he never stopped burning them. He could not. Once you have made that gesture, you cannot unmake it. The only way any of it makes sense, the march, the siege, the city rebuilt on the bones of the city it replaced, is if you go all the way to the end of it and keep going, past every reasonable stopping point, past every line a sensible man would have drawn, into the territory where a different kind of man operates, the territory where reasonable men do not go. That is why 500 years later we still talk about him. Not because he was good, and not because he was bad, because he was, for better and for immeasurably worse, exactly the man the moment required, and he gave it everything he had. And the moment, for its sins, took everything he offered. The epilogue, what remains. A few last things are worth noting, because they matter for how the story sits afterward. Malinche, La Malinche, Doña Marina, outlived the conquest and bore Cortés a son, Martin, whom he legitimized and took to Spain. She was later married off, at his direction, to one of his officers, and seems to have died sometime in the late 1520s, probably in her late 20s or early 30s. Her reputation in Mexican memory became one of the most freighted in any national mythology. La Malinche in modern Spanish is shorthand for a traitor, but the word contains a complexity that the slur erases. She was a slave, sold by her own people before the Spanish ever arrived. She had no country to betray. What she had, and what she used, was a position of leverage that no other woman in the Americas possessed, and she used it by all accounts with intelligence, courage, and a kind of political agency that her world did not ordinarily permit her. Whether what she did makes her a traitor, a survivor, or the first truly modern woman of the Americas depends on which Mexico you ask. Her reputation, in Mexican memory, became one of the most freighted in any national mythology. La Malinche in modern Spanish is shorthand for a traitor, but the word contains a complexity that the slur erases. She was a slave, sold by her own people before the Spanish ever arrived. She had no country to betray. What she had, and what she used, was a position of leverage that no other woman in the Americas possessed, and she used it by all accounts with intelligence, courage, and a kind of political agency that her world did not ordinarily permit her. Whether what she did makes her a traitor, a survivor, or the first truly modern woman of the Americas depends on which Mexico you ask. Cuauhtémoc, the last emperor, is today the one the Mexicans put on statues. There is a great bronze figure of him on the Paseo de la Fama in Mexico City, in heroic pose, bearing a spear. His image appears on coins. His name is given to neighborhoods, schools, and children. Modern Mexican national identity chose him rather than Cortés as the ancestor it wishes to acknowledge. There is a historical justice in that choice, and also a historical evasion. Modern Mexico is not, in its language or its laws or its capital or its churches, a Mexica nation. It is a mestizo nation, born of the violent collision that Cortés set in motion. To honor Cuauhtémoc and ignore Cortés is to honor the mother and refuse to name the father. Most nations do this with their origins. It is perhaps not a failing so much as an embarrassment. The descendants of the conquistadors still walk the streets of Mexico. So do the descendants of the Mexica. In most cases, they are the same people. And the city, Mexico City, the vast unsettled megalopolis that sits today in the basin of what used to be a lake, is still sinking. It has been sinking since the day the lake was drained. The soft, waterlogged soil of the old lake bed cannot hold the weight of the stone city that replaced it. Every year, Mexico City settles a few more inches into the earth. The great cathedral, built from the stones of the great temple, is visibly out of true. Its bell towers lean, its floors slope downward toward the center. Pumps work constantly in the foundations. Engineers estimate the city has dropped 30 feet or more since the conquest, and is still dropping. It is hard to stand in that square, the great Zocalo, the old sacred precinct of Tenochtitlán, the place where Moctezuma and Cortés first took the measure of each other on a November morning, without feeling that the metaphor is almost too obvious to bear. The city built on the ruin of a city, sinking slowly back into the water it displaced, under the weight of what was done to put it there. He was a lawyer. He was a mutineer. He was a conqueror. He was a destroyer. He was, for about 2 years of his life, the most astonishing improviser of large-scale violence the early modern world had yet produced. And then the ships were gone, the city was gone, and so was he.